community of data scientists can transform the ideas we've heard into action. During the introductory session, Dorothea Salo challenged us to confront and think about the elephant in the room that is data science has been and is still responsible for some social bad. That said, many people in data science here at UW-Madison and throughout the data science community are asking questions and designing research that furthers the social good. Here's one example that speaks to the urgency of putting our ideas and ideals about data science for social good into action. In December of 2020, Timnit Gebru, a widely respected AI ethics researcher, departed her position as a co-leader of Google's ethical AI team. Google says she resigned, Gebru said she was fired. The main point of contention between Gebru and Google was a paper she co-authored with Emily Bender at the University of Washington. The paper raises the risks and harms of large language models, which are an integral part of artificial intelligence. It's noteworthy that while Gebru experienced retaliation for her work on this paper, Bender, who is a tenured faculty member, did not. In Bender's words, I think this underscores the value of academic freedom. The paper that they wrote highlights some inconvenient truths about large language models. One of them is an accounting of the carbon footprint, energy use, and financial resources required to train various large models. The authors point out that there's a good chance the benefits of this work are likely to disproportionately accrue to more wealthy and privileged organizations and communities, while the marginalized communities are less likely to benefit from the direct outcome of the models, and in addition, will disproportionately bear the impacts of climate change that are exacerbated by the training of those models. Furthermore, large language models are typically trained on language culled from the internet that is infused with racist and sexist biases, and these biases may be trained into those same models. The authors suggest that these and other issues could be avoided by working with smaller, carefully curated language sets, which would allow scientists to both avoid biased language and reduce their carbon footprint. Gebru's story not only raises questions about bias in AI research, but also who is doing that research and whose voices are centered in this work. In her words, when you do AI ethics, if you don't center a certain group's point of view, no matter how well-intentioned you are, you're just not going to identify specific risks and harms. Everyone in the data science community has a role in ensuring that data science is used for social good. We've invited our panel here representing UW-Madison faculty, students, staff, and the broader community to talk about their work and share their thoughts about how we can move forward together. To begin, I'm going to call on each of our panelists to take about 2 minutes to briefly introduce themselves, and as part of that introduction, answer the question, how do you see yourself using data science for social good? And I'll start with just calling on Alnisa, if you could give a brief introduction. Yep, you're still muted.
There we go. All right. So hi, my name is Alnisa Allgood. I'm the founder and current executive director of Collaboration for Good. We're also known as Collab for Good, and we work with individuals and organizations on progressing and accelerating the progress to economic equity. Our focus really is on expanding the social good sector's capacity for accomplishing great things like reducing poverty, combating climate change, feeding the hungry, and more. And we are focused on the economic injustice of it is mostly just because we believe if you pay people well, they can do their jobs better, especially if they're not hungry and starving or having to work 4 jobs at the same time for do that. So we work to accelerate this with accelerating and training new social entrepreneurs, especially women of the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then I guess your question was, how do I see myself using data science for good? And I would say predominantly we use data science in 2 ways, around data literacy, data learning, and then around storytelling with data. Collab for Good actually does host a local conference called Data for Impact the Data for Impact conference, and our focus really is on not big data, not even large data, but little tiny data, data sets of 50 to maybe 5 million records. And yes, when I say 50, that's under 100 records in those data sets. We believe small data can make a big difference, and we work with organizations and individuals who work painstakingly hard to get a mailing list of 250 people or a donor list of 100 people or 50 participants into a classroom, or 10 members on their board of directors. And we want them to be able to learn lessons from that data, and those individuals tell stories and create a more data informed process.
All right, thank you, Alnisa. Next, I'm going to ask Sharif Issaka to introduce himself.
Yeah, sure. So I am Sharif Issaka. I am a junior majoring in computer science with certificate in African studies. I've had the pleasure of working with the Data Science Institute for a really long time under the supervision of our very own Whitney Sweeney. And that has really held my growth process as a student and also as a member of the data science community. A little about things I have been involved in. I am a research assistant for Professor Reginald Royston, where we examine technoculture in West Africa with a focus on Ghana. We are currently looking into AI, its applications and potential impact in Africa. I am also a research assistant for Professor Michaud as an independent study project where we are using a combination of genomic and observed traits in cows with different machine learning models to try to predict how well cows are able to convert feed into milk in a study we call feed efficiency. About how I see myself using data science for social good. As a student, I believe that the best I can do, and I'm trying to do, is to learn about the best techniques to leverage and use in the creation and deployment of data science technologies, techniques that truly affirm the positive values of difference, which in this respect could range from ensuring fair representation in data and robustness of technologies to considering the various possible applications of my technologies and how that affects societies and its members. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sharif. Next, we have Corey Jackson.
Thanks, Steve. Hey there, my name is Corey Jackson. I am currently an Anna Julia Cooper postdoctoral fellow in the Information School, and next year I'll be a tenure track professor in the Information School. So my work examines human behaviors in online settings, and specifically I tend to study how crowdsourcing affords new opportunities for collaboration among professionals and amateurs on the internet. The goal of my work kind of centers on using those insights to inform the design of novel social computational systems and tools that enhance communication and collaboration. So in our field, we often talk about viewing the world through a social technical lens. So thinking about not only the technology, but also how we should take into account human experiences and the social context in which technology is situated. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about data science with this sort of social technical lens. The field has grown so dramatically, but there's a real divide between data haves and have-nots. So more recently, I've been spending my time envisioning approaches to make the design of systems more equitable and making technology and data more accessible to larger swaths of society. So one project that I'm super excited about is working on with the Population Health Institute to reimagine more accessible access to their data portals so that data and information on their site could be used by people who may not have the requisite skills and knowledge to interpret and synthesize data. So a large part of data science for social good for me means centering the voices and issues that affect people who have been kind of put on the margins. Another area that I think about using data science for social good is in the classroom. So before I came to Wisconsin, I was a postdoc in Berkeley's Master's in Data Science program. And there I taught an introduction course on data science, where we focused on the soft skills required to do data science. And so I attended the Madison Data Portal workshop yesterday, and I think that's a great example of engaging students early on in data science for social good. So I was excited to hear about conversations around ethics and community engagement. And I think these types of engagements are really critical for engaging students, not only in the technical aspects of data science, but also the soft skills that you need. And so I spend my time teaching and advocating for data science curriculum that focuses not only on models, but advocating for this sort of human-centered approach to data science.
Thanks, Corey. And next we'll have Iain McConnell.
Thanks, Steve. My name's Iain McConnell. I'm a data scientist on campus at UW-Madison. I have a split appointment between the American Family Insurance Data Science Institute and the Space Science and Engineering Center. And my work has lately been largely focused on natural language processing. And for me, data science for the social good is largely about looking for those opportunities where it can be applied to that end, incorporating social good as a goal of the work. You know, that's the point of it, is to do good. So along those lines, I work with several groups across campus. I'm doing a recent collaboration with the team at SMPH and Public Health Medicine, developing an NLP-based tool using named entity recognition and unstructured contact tracing into view text to locate COVID transmission hotspots. And the goal is to enhance existing contact tracing efforts and to help slow the spread of disease. At the Institute for Research on Poverty, I'm working with their Wisconsin Administrative Data Core team. That's a database of information about people accessing state assistance programs. And the project's goal there, the work that I'm doing with them, is to lower the barriers to access that WADC database for researchers. So more work can be done focusing on helping those experiencing financial hardships and other problems. And they're also always interested in people collaborating and new work that could be done leveraging that data. So I really encourage you to check out the website. That's irp.wisc.edu/WADC. Message me about that if you're curious for more details. And I also have an independent research project, which is looking at public attention to weather and weather forecasts. And the goal is to understand what people are paying attention to in weather forecasts and warnings, and then maybe help shape those warnings and forecasts to be a bit more impactful or actionable. And the current angle of that work is to look at how people are reacting to data or forecasts on Twitter. Thank you.
Thanks, Iain. And our final panelist is Irene Ong.
Thank you. My name is Irene Ong. I'm an assistant professor in the departments of OBGYN and biostatistics and medical informatics. I mostly focus on healthcare issues in terms of doing data science for the social good. I have been extremely fortunate to, especially having come from a single parent family and as an immigrant, have had many opportunities to, or at least to be educated in this area, and being in the position that I'm in, to be able to collaborate with clinicians and basic scientists who are doing research in healthcare. Specifically, I have been mostly working with Doctors Christine Sergi and Jim Gurin on looking at the role of the environment and its impact on the development of immune systems in the context of allergies and asthma in Wisconsin farm and non-farm families, especially children as they develop. I'm also working closely with Doctors Alex Stanek-Kostick and Ian Bird to identify biomarkers and understand the mechanisms underlying preeclampsia. And further, I'm also working with many other PIs at the Cancer Center, looking at cancer research, and then in particular with Dr. Sinead Warren Anderson, to study genetic epidemiology of vitamin D and cancer risk in African Americans. I think it is, at least the way I see myself using data science for social good is really being able to utilize the skills for helping improve people's lives and to be healthy. I think part of the things that Corey mentioned earlier is really important in terms of getting the people involved and educated at a level that would encourage many people who are sort of underprivileged to be able to use data science and identify problems and issues and highlight them in a way that can help change policies. And I think that those are really the main ways that could potentially help change, make lasting changes. So, thanks.
Thank you, Irene. And just briefly, thanks again to all our panelists for joining us for this session. Now we're going to move into the Q&A section. And during this section, we're going to start with a predefined set of questions for our panelists, who will each have 7 minutes to respond to that question. And after each panelist has been asked their question, at the very end, we're going to follow up with a Q&A from the audience. So to the audience, if any of you have questions for the panelists, feel free to enter them into the chat at any time during this session, and we'll accumulate them and organize them and try and ask as many as we can with the time we have remaining at the end of this session. So moving into the questions, our questions are unique for each panelist, and we're going to start with Corey Jackson. Earlier, Corey, I mentioned the example of the paper authored by Tina Gebru and Emily Bender, the protection provided by academic freedom, and the question of whose voices are centered in this work. With all that in mind, what are, to your perspective, what are the hurdles to successful promotion in an academic career in data science?
Well, I'll preface this by saying I'm only a postdoc now, so I'm not aware of all the politics behind the scenes. But I think in the field of data science, there isn't really much of a problem with academic promotion. I think right now we're dealing with a sort of a supply side problem in the labor market, and universities are filling that gap by developing new data science degrees, which we need to teach, which we need folks to actually come in and teach. On the research side, there's been an explosion in the amount and types of data being generated. So there's a need for data science researchers to help with modeling. Here at Madison, and there are a few folks on the call here, the Data Science Institute has a group of researchers from many academic departments collaborating with the Department of Health in Wisconsin and the National Guard, looking to optimize, COVID-19 vaccine allocation. And they're using data science solutions to model these sort of localized problems and providing recommendations to the state. And those model parameters are also kind of being tuned to incorporate these measures of fairness and really trying to understand bias. And so problems needing technical solutions aren't going away. But in academia, there's also folks who remain critical of technology and its sort of pervasive role in society. So, at universities across the US and the world, we see groups sprouting up to provide these critiques and sometimes opposition to data science and data science tech. So for example, the AI Now Institute at NYU. And I think for academia, this tension is good and the critiques are necessary in order to kind of push the field in the right direction. But I think that stands in contrast to what we see in industry. So, in large tech companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and even smaller ones like Clearview, who are providing facial recognition technology, they're using data science indiscriminately in some cases. And we're starting to see what happens when, you work for one of these companies and for all the lip service around ethical applications of tech and algorithms, there are clear limits to how critical you can be. So obviously, Dr. Gebru's work sort of challenging existing language models at Google. But she also co-authored a paper with folks looking at facial recognition technology. And one of the findings was that it's less accurate at identifying women and people of color. But the language model paper, those language models are critical to a number of Google's products. And so this paper questioning whether enough time had been put into identifying those potential risks and then developing and expanding these language models to other areas of society. There are real problems with how Google sort of took that. And so among these risks, I think, Steve, you pointed these out earlier, was that this massive amount of data, the massive amount of data that these models are trained on. So they're built from language around the internet, which is written by people, and it's a reflection of our historical, cultural, and societal dialogue. But recently, there's been a shift in cultural norms, right? We've begun to reimagine gender pronouns, or as a result of the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements, there's a shift towards new anti-sexist and anti-racist vocabulary. So these shifts in our sort of cultural and societal dialogue are not going to be well represented in these language models. And so, as Steve pointed out earlier, there are real limitations to putting these models into production. These models are really going to only benefit wealthy organizations. And we know that one of the outcomes of these models is that they use enormous amounts of energy, which, is going to, if we think about climate change, it's going to hit marginalized communities the hardest. And so there's this fear in these language models, for example, that they're going to be homogenized. And so if they're built on data from the richest countries or more well-to-do communities, people who have the access and the resources, the data will reflect their ideas, their politics, their practice. And if we leave these unexamined, these language models will have negative impacts. And so the researchers in Dr. Gebru's paper bring up this example of how Facebook mistranslated a Palestinian man's post, which said good morning in Arabic, and that got translated to as attack them in Hebrew. And he was arrested for this. So there are real challenges to putting these models in production, and we need folks who are going to be able to critique these models as well. And I don't want to paint a picture that tech or data science is bad. I think there are benefits, but it's important to allow these critical examinations of technology and algorithms because they do govern society. And so knowing where these limitations exist mean that we can develop strategies to combat them. So asking questions about potential bias and discrimination in any context, whether it's in academia or industry, should be welcomed. And so I think this story kind of underscores the benefits of academic or intellectual freedom and why it should be supported. And I think academia isn't perfect, but one of the reasons that I chose a career in academia is because you do have the greater intellectual freedom and the job security associated with tenure. And so I'm encouraged by the growth of academic centers to combat the rise of data discrimination and focus on social justice. Additionally, cities are starting to take a stance. A growing list of cities like Oakland, Berkeley, Boston, San Francisco indicated that they'll no longer use facial recognition technology. And until the technology improves, I think that's an appropriate step. But we're also seeing companies like IBM put a moratorium on offering, developing, and researching facial recognition technology. And there are also folks who have left industry and created foundations. So the Center for Humane Technology, I think, is one that I can point to. I think this story is just a really good example of why academic freedom is important, and being able to critique mainstream AI practices will create a better world.
Great, thanks for that, Corey. Next question, we're going to move to Issaka. Sharif, how does data science training at UW-Madison reflect the social good or social justice framework?
Sure, thanks for the question. Before I dive into UW-Madison, specific issues, I think there is something we must all think about before we proceed. And it's something when I first saw this question, I couldn't help but wonder, what is social justice? I mean, we all think of issues like abuse against, say, the LGBT community or racism against Black people as being social injustices. But that does not so answer the question of what social justice is. And unless we think about this and establish a baseline, I think whatever we say today would be less impactful, as we will all have like different frames of references. And adding to this question is another question. With another question is there a metric for measuring social justice or social good? Is there, if there is, then who is responsible for establishing this metric? Is there a way we in this context being society as a collective can attain social good or justice? In my attempt to answer these questions, I think that social justice cannot and should not, for that matter, be regarded as a measure or a state or something that is attainable, like with a percentage, but as a process that is unending, a process that will affirm the positive values of difference, the positive values of anti-racism, openness to others, inclusivity, and hospitality. Not just that, but also upholding the balance and fairness in the contract between society and its members. That if I wake up someday, as Corey pointed out, if I make a post, my society shouldn't, I shouldn't be afraid to be who I want to be, and the society should stand for me when I need it most. And I trust that so we shouldn't be treated differently with respect to things like race, gender, ethnicity, income. This to me is both what social justice is and the means of attaining it. My attempt to answer this question is influenced mainly by the African ideology of Ubuntu that can be explained simply as, I am what I am because of who we all are, that we are insignificant in our individuality and that our existence is to others. I believe that it is through the Ubuntu approach or a similar approach of not seeing ourselves as just, say, students or researchers, but as pieces of the bigger fabric of society, can we really achieve social justice or social good? So now on whether the data science training at UW reflects the social good framework, I think there are two different and not necessarily mutually exclusive ways of looking at it. One is the teaching of the technicalities of data science itself, and the other is making people understand the power that they are being given with this kind of training. So you can think of it like in two ways, one being the training aspect or the teaching of data science, and the aspect being the application of the data science training that we attain. Earlier, I stated that part of how I see myself using data science for social good is learning the best techniques for using and applying tools that can be used for creating and deploying robust technologies or models. I believe that the university does a phenomenal job on that front. Using my research with Professor Faris as an example, I started this project with minimal knowledge of best data science techniques and tools, but Professor Faris's guidance and insistence on nothing but the best, and with the guidance of amazing people like Dr. Liliana Sado and Dr. Steve Wangen here, I can confidently say that I am a way better quantitative researcher now than I was when I started this research project. So on that front, I really think that the university has brilliant scientists and educators who are willing and ready to share their knowledge to scholars in the making, like myself. However, on whether the university does a good job at making people understand the kind of power they possess with this data science training and making the data science space itself with respect to, say, more inclusive with respect to, say, including more marginalized people into this space, I would say not so much. And why do I say that the university is not doing a good job on this front? And again, I'm going to use myself as an example here. Till this day, I am the only Black computer science student that I know in my year. And I know a lot of people, I probably know a quarter of people on this call. And also I'm aware of just one Black female undergraduate in the entire CS department. And I recently learned that there is just one African-American CS student who has done an independent study research in the past 6 years at the university. These are really shocking statistics and should force us as a community to think about ways of fixing this. To make matters worse, there isn't a single required course by the CS department that really addresses the issues of inequality or biases in data. So in short, I believe that the university is training brilliant and highly skilled next generation builders, but the university does not expose them to a diverse environment, neither does the university make them learn about such an environment. I'm always scared by the fact that most computer science students from this university will graduate without ever having to learn about how biased and unequal the current technology and data science space is, and how they might end up perpetuating such biases and inequalities. I am running out of time here, so it's like my quick suggestions on how the university could integrate a good framework into its data science training are quite pretty simple. One would be that the university should actively include minorities into the data science space. The other way could be to make CS students take at least one class that exposes them to issues in our current technologies. I would highly encourage a course like Code and Power, a class taught by Professor Dorothea Salo and Professor Reginald Royston. To end, I would like to say thank you for listening, and remember the teaching of Ubuntu that we are insignificant in our individuality and that we all have an active role in attaining social justice through data science. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sharif. Our next question is for Alnisa. Alnisa, an example of data science and data sharing being used to benefit communities is Rebecca Jones's creation of an alternative COVID-19 dashboard for the state of Florida. Jones alleged that the Florida Department of Public Health pressured her to manipulate and misrepresent COVID-19 infection data with the state's economic interest in reopening. In response, she launched alternative dashboards with open data, with instructions for others to create their own dashboards and analyses with that data. Florida State Police raided Jones's home in December of 2020 to investigate communications she had with the Florida Department of Health employees and suspected hacking into the department's computer system. This raises issues around transparency as an ethical concern. There are many examples of engaging communities in data science, such as yesterday's workshop on Madison's open data portal, and the lightning talks described how crowdsourced data is being used to address questions around climate change and organic agriculture. The question for you, Alnisa, how can community engagement and partnerships advance data science for the social good, including making data available to the public?
I guess I would start off with the biggest statement I could say would be application. I'm partially kidding about that, but I think it's also true. A lot of data science focuses really in on the theory and the theoretical, and I work in a world of practitioners, right? People who need their data to be tangible and usable, they need it to be accurate and verifiable. And on their behalf, they're also coming up with really creative ways to use that data. So I think data needs to be compassionate, engaged, critical, and critical applications of lessons learned by data is essential. And I think what I'd say when I use the word critical, I mean it in two senses of the word. Critical as a critique of where your data might fail you. So where biases come in, where ethics are compromised, or when people are using it to marginalize people in communities and things like that. But I also mean critical as in it's really important that the communities learn how to better use data to combat systemic issues like racism, sexism, poverty, homelessness, and things like that, and that they can use data to imagine new possibilities and back up kind of their theory of change with data for that. So I see data as something that can empower individuals to become more vital participants in their community. And this can range, I think, from basic data literacy to, which would cover things like how to find, understand, critique, and provide data to others. That can range into community decision making. How do you use data and digital technologies as a force of truth and a force of justice, and acknowledge that there's a pervasiveness in the collection of data that has inherent bias in it. And that inherent bias has been building into those systems for years or decades or more. And all the knowledge that we have from the past is going to contribute into our future knowledge. And a lot of that knowledge is devastatingly, critical of Black, brown, and Black and brown communities, people of color, women in general, and things like that. I mean, from language models to just like, let's say something like jail data, which really focuses in and puts a lot of variables on people who have been incarcerated, but without the critique of who's getting incarcerated and why, right? So I think more use for community decision making, making data more tangible, I think, to communities is also, I think, important. And sometimes that's just small little things. Like right now, I'm enamored of like a no code solution, no code solutions across the board. But my particular one that I've been using is Glide Apps, because it basically allows you to take almost any list of data that a community driven organization might have that they've collected over time and make it touchable, tangible to people, that they can actually use it. You can kind of convert it into an app where people can drill down into the data. They can ask questions, they can participate in conversations around it, but it can also be carried in their pocket as opposed to sitting on a server or in a research paper somewhere that nobody knows anything about or has access to. Then otherwise, I would say, obviously, collecting data to answer questions, finding stories in data. I think right now, especially since a lot of the stuff that affects social justice issues on the street or in communities like neighborhoods, cities, and state is around it's around like the stories that people tell, and can they tell a story well. And I think we need to shift that from not just telling a story well, but making sure that the story is accurate and that it combats like historical biases and doesn't necessarily put forward, I guess, discriminatory models for that. And one of the examples that I can speak to a little bit, when you were talking about how movements like the Black Lives Matter, and of course, like the Florida person, but I'm going to focus in on the Black Lives Matter. Here locally, we have an organization called Freedom Inc. And they work with Black and brown, predominantly Black and Hmong populations here in Madison, and they've done the just lost the name of the thing, but the basically the defund the police, changing infrastructure of jails, and a lot of work around some of those issues. And we had M. Adams, who's one of the co-executive directors, I think, of Freedom Inc. right now, lead a discussion on how they worked with a data person to learn how to better analyze all of the data from the Black Lives Matter movement, and then create really concrete, compressed stories that they could then share with the community at large about how data was being used against Black and Brown communities, against communities of color across the board, against immigrants, and even against women, and how like those biases kind of created situations that, if as a social justice movement or a racial equity movement, or even if you just wanted to deal with issues of like homelessness and stuff like that, the data needed to be presented better, and the storytelling needed to include where the data might fail, but also just the facts needed to be there. So because people will try to push that information down and say that that information is wrong. And so the ability to rapidly verify the data and be able to produce, information that backs it up and tells that story well about like, this data is true, these people have verified these data sets, and still tell a good story, I think is incredibly important to the community engagement part, and partnerships to advance data for social good, because people need the data to be practical and applicable, and they need to be able to use it to get things done in the street and in social media.
Great, thanks for that, Alnisa. Next, we're going to move to Iain. Iain, how do you incorporate social justice ethics into data analysis when you're not the one collecting data? Also, part of that, how do you come into that situation or influence it?
So great question. Thanks, Steve. So like Sharif, I kind of want to sort of think about what does social justice ethics mean in this context. And I think really right now, social justice is sort of referring to everyone deserving equal economic, political, and social opportunities, irrespective of their race, gender, or religion. And ethics are really just what you think are important and how you live your life. It's your kind of your embodied values. So it's really like, how do you bring that greater sense of what's important and just into your work? Because to me, data analysis kind of is my job. So that's how I kind of approach this question. So I really feel like it's important to incorporate social justice ethics into the entire work process. So it's not just when you sit down to code, but when you just initially start work, not just because it's the right thing to do and it's just, but it will also produce higher quality work, which gets better results for everyone. So I think, it's not just, this is something that's important to do because it's right, but it's also should be easier to do because it's probably good for the bottom line if you're working in a corporate setting. So as an educated white male, I'm really aware that I'm coming from a position of privilege in almost every situation that I'm in. And that's likely to bias my own thoughts in many ways. And so it's really important, even before starting that coding, to kind of think over and respect that part of the problem. And it is part of the problem. And often as a data scientist, and especially in my role on campus, I'm working with teams of domain specialists. So I'm bringing data science skills and knowledge to new areas frequently. And you're often working with very distinct groups of people in those spaces that have that experience in that domain. So understanding that political aspect of your collaboration when it starts and as it goes along is super important too. So what are your actions going to do to influence that collaboration? And what is that going to do to influence how effective you can be? And how are you going to be perceived? Like if you just join the team as the data scientist who's going to solve the problems, is that you might be perceived as a threat by people who are on the team already? Like here's the person who's coming to sort of take over and do your job. Or if the way you approach that problem, you might be able to be seen as more of a valued contributor, someone who's going to help and augment the team and lift people up and do more for the group as a whole. So that's a super important aspect of starting work for me. And there's going to be a lot that you don't know at the start of that process. And I think it's natural to come to the start of this work with a lot of assumptions and hunches and guesses about what the data will be like and what working with people will be like and what the answers will be. And I think it's an important discipline to put those aside to start with and just do some listening. You want to hear from the people you're going to be working with and find out what their pain points are in their current work. Are there regular things they're doing that are difficult or annoying? And what challenges are there to achieving the team's goals? What are they trying to achieve? What do they want from you? How are you maybe going to help them achieve their goals? And understand, you probably can bring some extra stuff to this as well, but trying to help them with that problem is the thing that you really need to hear often in those meetings. So it's great to ask specific questions about what needs to be addressed and challenge your own hunches and assumptions. So you can ask if it's true, whether you can assume this or this thing is true about the data set, or the answer might look like this. And those initial ideas are probably things that they've thought about as well and have probably complex answers for. So the initial start to the data analysis for me is to get off on the right foot and not perpetuate the problems of privilege and inequality through work. So when you're joining that project, it's about respecting the people you're going to work with, understand all the perspectives involved, really grasp the challenges, and then know what the outcomes are desired to be before you start coding. So then going down a level into the data, getting your hands on the raw material. So very often as a data scientist, when you're coming to start work, you're not the one who's collecting the data. Someone else has already done that for you, and it might be the people you're working with, or it could be a third party. So you're often coming to an existing data source that is the motivator for the project. So that's the data you're going to use, but you don't have any control over its starting point, at least. So you like on any project, you have to do a lot of your own exploratory data analysis. You need to know what the data looks like, are the labels and features skewed? If you're making predictions regarding people, who are those people? How are they represented in the data? And then how are you going to address those inevitable shortcomings? I don't think there are many data sets that don't have their own built-in biases and problems. So, there could be some simple answers to this, such as under or oversampling classes that are under or overrepresented. But maybe there might be a bit more to that. And exploratory data analysis can go on for a while, but I think it's super necessary to really understand your data in a data science project. And you're more likely to be effective if you really know your data source. So doing this with a mind to understanding what biases could be present right at the root of the project is super important. So during that process, you're going to move into the modeling at that point. And I think it's important to think about what specific data your model really needs. Will it generalize better with fewer inputs? And there's no reason, I think, in every case to include any variable that mentions race, for example. Like, does your model really need that? Is that important in this setting? Why would that be important? Those are questions you should be asking yourself about inputs to your models. And many variables can also be a proxy for race, like zip code, for example. And race is just one example, but I think, obviously a very salient and contemporary thing to discuss. So thinking about where that bias could be coming from in your model, and that it might be hidden in some of the variables that you're using, and that your data pre-processing techniques might be able to ameliorate some of that. Like, you do need to have some kind of location information, but do you need to have all the digits of the zip code? Maybe you just need the first two. And that might help you generalize more as a whole as well. So there might be, it's not like you're losing by doing that. And of course, the model itself is going to have its own shortcomings and biases, and part of that is the data that's going into it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that before you even start the work, that that bias and shortcoming will exist in the model. And you will have to actively work to find out what that bias is and what their shortcomings are. And so you can use model explainability or interpretability to review those outcomes and understand your model behaviors. So knowing that that's going to come up, you've got to work to reduce it. Use your interpretability, explainability tools like partial dependence plots, permutation feature importance, even surrogate models. There are lots of tools available, and it's getting easier and easier to do this every day. So that's a necessary part of your work. And I think last of all, but not least, is to also think about the applications of your project. Like, how is this resulting model or analysis that you're responsible for? How is that going to be used or interpreted? You know, who are you giving it to, and what are they going to do with it downstream? If the model outputs a number that says bad, are they going to see that and say, oh, 100% this is bad, so I will act? Or will there be a more fine-tuned understanding of the model says bad, but it's not super sure that it's bad, or the model says bad, but actually 60% of the time it doesn't get that right under these circumstances? I mean, deploying things to production maybe in a state like that would require maybe a limited user base, but it's important that not only do you know how it's going to be used, but you also know how people might interpret the results that are coming out of it. Like, if you were going to predict the likelihood of someone missing a credit card payment, that could potentially be very helpful information that could be used to assist someone, but it could also be used to cause problems for people that might miss a credit card payment. So I think there's a trust aspect in that as well. And overall, I think just what I'm kind of driving at here is, I think part of your work as a data scientist is to acknowledge that data science isn't necessarily a panacea. Your contribution is going to solve a part or some of the problem, but it's not going to be the end of that problem. So working in that understanding that you have some limitations in your ability to affect things is important. So just to quickly sum up, there was quite a bit there. I just think about using social justice ethics at several levels in my work, and just going through them. It's the project, you know, will the project itself be for the social good? Is it direct or indirect? How is it going to be used? You know, how is this going to make the world a better place? Who am I working with? Who's not represented on the team? Can we involve people that aren't represented? How am I as a data scientist being perceived? Am I working to assist these people, or am I causing extra problems in my approach to the work? And then there's the model itself, all the typical bias issues, what's being modeled and how is this going to be used? And then there's the results. So, or the applications. Will the users of this model be able to be sufficiently understanding of what the outputs are to use it in a sensible way? So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Iain. All right, and our final question, structured question here, is for Irene. Irene, how can researchers incorporate ethics and the social good into data science?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the other panelists have mentioned some of the issues and that are involved and in using data science and how it needs to be improved. But specifically, I think that all data scientists should be trained on the ethics of using data science for social good, and especially, as Sheriff pointed out, that we need to do at UW a better job at making these things like biases and at how data science tools can be used either for good or bad inadvertently. And so making sure that we sort of follow like an ethical checklist is really important. So because I work in healthcare, there are training that I have to take because of laws that have been put in place, in terms of how data is handled, how data is collected, getting consent, and a lot of these other issues that have been slowly worked out over the years because of issues that have happened in healthcare research. And I think similarly, we need to do the same with data science. It is important to educate everybody in the power that data science can provide. There are also limitations, as you had pointed out, but there is an ethical checklist from the Data Science of Social Good Foundation, which I think highlights a lot of these important things that should be considered. Importantly, who will be affected by our work? How do we ensure that by doing good for one group, we're not actually hurting someone else or some other group? And so the main things to think about before you even start are, sort of project selection and scoping, deciding whether data science is the right approach for solving the problem. Like, is the problem we're solving the symptom of a greater issue? So for some of the work that I'm doing in healthcare, I realized that there are findings that I wish that I could say, okay, we should just get rid of poverty. Then it would solve a lot of these health issues that people, these specific groups are facing. And education is another. But so it is important to be able to use data science for the right, I guess, question that you're trying to solve, because you could use data science to point out a lot of these things, but really the underlying issue could be something else, as I just mentioned. And then, as Iain mentioned and earlier, building the team and making sure that the people who are involved in the team is really important. So does the team include individuals or institutions or other people, like stakeholders, that are ultimately going to be affected by the tool? And in healthcare, we try to do that the same by making sure that the patients who are going to be affected are also involved in the conversation. And so making sure that people, so not just the data scientists and those students who have the capacity to use the data science tools, are the only ones involved. So the other things to ensure are that the members on a team are actually, doing this for the right reasons, not just to pad their resume, but also, like, are they really passionate about what they're doing? Like, are they really learning this for a greater cause, right? Trying to improve the problem, because having a passionate or motivated person on your team is going to be able to push the solution in a much farther, bring it farther along than someone who's just interested in learning for the sake of learning. And then with respect to data collection, when you're collecting data, you want to be sure that it's not impeding on anyone's privacy, that people that you're studying have consented to having their data being used. Were they, given the option of opting out? And yeah, so because I work in healthcare, there are samples that are being collected from people who volunteer their samples. And so it is really important to be sure to let people know that they can opt out at any time. So including if they do give consent, if they decide that they no longer want to be part of that, they can be removed from that. And so then moving forward, we don't use their data in the analyses. And then within the analysis itself, what bias is the team introducing? And a lot of these, I think, have been touched on by Iain in previously, by considering which variables are being considered by the analyses. There might be selection bias. And then if the person who's doing the data analysis doesn't have the expertise in that domain, they may not see all the nuances that would be necessary to go into modeling that system. And so again, this goes back to why it's important to having the right team members and experts related to the data or problem that you're studying. And then again, making sure that people are not going to be using the data that's biased in one way or the other, and in terms of sex or race or gender, and making that becoming a problem in the future. So the other question, or with respect to analysis, is just whether the analysis is sufficiently transparent. I think it is important that people publish the methods in which they use to do the data analysis, because if you don't really understand what went into the analyses, it's the interpretation of the results can be different than what you would otherwise be able to pull out from the analysis methods. Again, being able to, in terms of the implementation, when people are considering which methods to use, or the models that are going to be implemented in place, people should be aware that there are specific shortcomings of different types of models. So for example, deep learning models, which are very widely used these days, are really great at performing well, but they're less interpretable. And so being aware of these sorts of things, I think are important, and making other people aware of that is not just for those who are doing data science, but the other people who are using it, aware of that is also important. And then also the consequences of the predictions. So in terms of the predictions that are made, if you get a false positive or false negative, what are the consequences? So as Iain mentioned earlier, with respect to getting your credit card, getting a call from your credit card company saying that there might have been a fraud used, they're okay with more false negatives because they don't mind making a few extra calls, because it's much better than if they don't catch a real instance of fraud. But in the healthcare situation for COVID detection, we have to think about how that can affect the outcomes in terms of transmission of COVID, and so those are the types of things that should be considered as well. So it is important to make sure that ethics is front and center rather than sort of an afterthought or sort of sidelined. And I think it should be taught as a course, or be required training as part of a data scientist education. We do have ethics trainings for people who are working in healthcare related fields. So I think it should be the same. And then I think, what good does data science do? It can provide a big way to sort of tackle local and global issues, being able to identify what the goal is, as Corey mentioned earlier. How can we maximize benefit to everybody instead of maximizing profit, and being able to set that whatever goal collectively, either through communication or social media or some form, is going to be important, because I think using those metrics can allow us to identify what are the best policies, how data science can allow us to figure out what are the best policies that can help maximize these benefits. and to utilize the resources that are available. I think some of the ways that data science can make a difference is really being able to address these or point out these issues, as Alnisa pointed out, poverty, homelessness, and how we can make changes in the community, but only if we can really also teach them how to present their results, either through writing, social media, public speaking, and networking, so that they can inform others about what they've learned, and conveying that invaluable knowledge so that others can make use of that information. But again, that all needs to be done in a ongoing manner, because as with research in science, we present our results, but we get critiqued by other peers, or they find their findings are similar too, and then we sort of decide, okay, this is the way that it really is. But we, by having everybody sort of presenting their results and having a way to sort of communicate, then people can learn, which is ultimately the right underlying issue and how to solve it, how best to solve it. So thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Irene. So that concludes our structured questions section. I believe we're going to stop the recording at this point.